It is the 5th of January, 2022. This is the third story in the anthology. It is called Silent. Part of the fun of the nights that Paul took Daniel to the movies on campus was that the boys so loved comedy. Lindsay never showed much interest unless it was a musical that was likely to have dance sequences. But Daniel was different. Any chance he got to experience the grown-up world, he would take. He absorbed the world around him with a seriousness that surprised people who didn't live in the same house with him. His questions went beyond the ordinary curiosity of a child. He came to them from a place of insight and sought increased depth. The group of students who decided what movies would come up from New York in their big hexagonal boxes for projection in the student center on Friday nights couldn't always be trusted to have the best taste. But comedies and science fiction always drew Daniel's interest. Daniel would go through the schedule and highlight the ones he wanted to go to. If he didn't have something else, and he almost never did, Paul took him to the films, even the ones the boy was unlikely to fully understand. On the drives back afterward, Daniel would sit in the front seat with him. He would fold his legs up under him so that he could rest his forehead against the window and watch the world go by. And then he would turn to say something that blew Paul's mind, that small boy with the quick wit and the wonderful questions. After 2001: A Space Odyssey, Daniel had been silent all the way to the car. He had gotten in without a word and knelt on the passenger seat, lost in thought. Paul had the sense that he was running the whole film over in his mind, a frame at a time, trying to make sense of it all. About 10 minutes from home, he finally spoke. I think that movie is only pretending to be about space. I think it's about time. They had explored that thought together for the remainder of the drive. Daniel's level of intellect constantly startled Paul, whether it expressed as insight or as humor. Ellen often referred to the boy as being 7 going on 40, and Paul wondered if that somehow registered as pressure for the child, but he understood what she meant. Once a visiting professor had stayed in the guest room. He'd gotten up early and had breakfast with the kids before they went off to school. When Paul got out of the shower, dressed, and came downstairs, he found the man sipping coffee, bemused. He asked if the professor was okay, and he'd said, I'm fine. I just spent 15 minutes exchanging one-liners with a 6-year-old. Yeah, he's something, isn't he? I think he knows about 5,000 jokes. Professor Dmitri shook his head slowly. Maybe, but I think he was making some of them up on the spot. He might have been. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Now, as they sat together waiting for the movie to start, Paul was as excited as his son, even if he was better able to contain his enthusiasm. He remembered Daniel's response to the Marx Brothers. He remembered Daniel's joy at his discovery of Charlie Chaplin. Tonight would be one of those nights. Daniel was about to get his first taste of Buster Keaton, and through his son, Paul would get to see the stone-faced stuntman anew again. Daniel bounced in his seat. He swung his legs. He practically vibrated with anticipation. Settle down, D. Daniel said, okay. Then, sorry. Then, after a minute, Butch Brown, Buster Keaton. Right. Then the lights went down and the movie began. Many of the college students, he realized, were probably seeing these gags for the first time, just like his son. While they laughed and cheered, Daniel watched, eyes wide. Whenever Paul glanced over, he found Daniel grinning up into the flicker. Daniel stared as Buster's car got caught on the tracks. He tried to restart it. He tried to push it. The train approached. He tried to move the car, and at the last possible moment gave up and ran away as the train blasted through on the next track over, missing the car entirely. The room burst into laughter, and Buster, relieved, turned to walk back toward the car. A train came from the other direction and destroyed the vehicle. Buster stumbled back a step, tripped, fell on his ass, rolled back into a reverse somersault, and came back to his feet, dusting himself off, casting a sad look of betrayal toward the receding train. Daniel barked a sharp, "Ha!" It wasn't a true laugh. It was a startled, excited acknowledgement of a perfectly constructed sight gag. Paul glanced over, and Daniel nodded his approval of the film or of the joke or of the acrobatic skill. Paul nodded back, agreeing with whatever it was that Daniel had approved of. Paul was not old enough to have seen First Run Keaton, of course, but he had discovered the silence at an art house in San Francisco during the 3 years he and Ellen had lived there in the late 50s. He had fallen in love with them then, finding them funny and engrossing in a way none of the films of his childhood had been. He wondered now if he'd laughed or just barked in intellectual approval. He remembered going to the Purple Onion and seeing the great comedians of the time working out their material. He still had a reel-to-reel tape that he'd made of that evening, but it was not the performances he remembered most clearly. It was seeing the comics, sitting at a table near the back of the room, watching one another perform as they prepared for or came down from their own sets. It was fascinating to see the way professionals watched comedy. They didn't laugh, not often at least. Mostly they sat in appreciative silence as if it was a ballet they witnessed or a Pinter play. The better the joke, the more they nodded. When someone at that table laughed, it was often at a joke that the rest of the audience failed to reward, a signal of approval in the face of dissenting public opinion. Was it genetic? Where did that kind of observational removal originate? After the film, while all the students filed out, Daniel kept his seat, looking up at the white screen as if the movie might start again at any moment. Paul sat beside him, wondering what he was thinking. He found himself trying to imagine what the experience had been for the boy, his boy. When the theater was empty, except for a kid whose work study arrangement had him sweeping out the dropped popcorn and collecting the discarded soda cups, Paul said, "You about ready?" "Yeah." But then there was a long pause before Daniel stood up and let the spring-loaded seat fold itself back flat against the row. Paul lit a cigarette as they walked up the aisle. Daniel remained very quiet. His eyes narrowed from time to time as though he was trying to see something in the far distance, though Paul had known him long enough to know that he was just thinking, sorting through complex ideas. They got into the car. Daniels did a bit of shtick as he opened the door, smacking it with his hand and snapping his head back to make it seem he had hit himself in the nose. He didn't do it with full commitment. It was just a small experiment in physical comedy. But he looked up at Paul to see if he'd gotten a laugh. Paul realized he knew something about how comedy works. It'll never work if you check for reaction afterward. Daniel nodded. He said, "Huh." He climbed into his kneeling position in the front, the seat he only got when the two of them were alone in the car. If Ellen was with them, she got the front seat, naturally. And when both kids were in the car, they sat in the back together to avoid arguments and resentments. Paul drove and pretended not to notice Daniel picking his nose absently over to his right. Eventually, Daniel spoke confidently. "I think I could do that." "Yeah?" "Yeah. I mean, I think I'd have to learn some stuff so I wouldn't get hurt, but I think I could do almost all of those bits." Paul nodded. He imparted a little bit of father's wisdom. The mark of the great artists is that they make it look effortless. Daniel went silent for a long, long while. Paul fought the urge to ask him what he was thinking. He wanted to hear the details of what went on in that kid's head. He wanted to break down the machinations, deconstruct the process of learning and thinking, but he knew that he would not get the answers he sought. He would get some cryptic statement or some simple observation, droplets that hinted at unseen waterfalls, dust motes hanging bright in a shaft of light that implied a sun just out of frame. You enjoyed it? Yeah, a lot. Then after a moment, next week is the skinny man, the thin man. I know, Daniel lied. I like to call it the skinny man. Paul said, no, you don't. You got it wrong. They sat in silence for a moment. Yeah? Daniel nodded. Yeah. They rode in silence. Do you understand why the truth is important, Daniel? Yeah, Daniel lied. He waited a moment just to find out if there would be clarification, but he couldn't ask now that he'd claimed to understand, and Paul was aware of all of it. He wanted to call the boy on it again, but it seemed to him that it might be good for the kid to know that he could have secrets, that people would not always be able to see through the lies, that it would be up to him alone to maintain integrity. Is that a comedy? It is. It's a mystery and a comedy. It might be a little bit complicated for you. Okay, then, but we can go anyway, right? I'll check my calendar. They rode together, Paul watching the road, Daniel watching the passing landscape. After what seemed to Paul like too much time to still be involved in the same conversation, Daniel said, you'll check your calendar. I will. Okay. They rode. Paul did not know what Daniel was thinking about. Paul thought about his own father, about moments decades earlier in a much larger car with a man who always seemed on the verge of rage. He wondered if he was ruining his son. He knew he was the only father in town who did not play catch with his kid, who did not coach a sport. He didn't know anything about hunting or fishing. He worried that Daniel might not be having any of the fun that childhood was supposed to provide. The boy seemed so serious, even about comedy. He seemed serious. The lying looked like it could become a problem too. He wasn't sure what that was about. He would keep an eye on it, he decided. Maybe the boy was just testing boundaries, finding out where he ended and other people began. He glanced over and found that Daniel had dozed off, face pressed against the cool glass of his window. He opened the window on his side of the car, just a crack, and lit a cigarette. He pulled smoke into his lungs and wondered if he should buy a 16mm movie camera for Daniel to experiment with. He imagined the boy running around doing stunts for laughs, pratfalls, and sight gags. He chuckled in the silence. Daniel stirred in his sleep and muttered, "What's funny?" Paul said, "You can sleep, buddy. Nothing's funny." Daniel said, "Boy, I hope that's not true." He was already asleep again, so he did not see Paul, driving through the silent night, nod his approval rather than laughing. Listen to your breath. So that was the third story in the collection, Silent, and gives a sense of where Daniel and his father find their connection through comedy. The next one, next week, the fourth story in this anthology is called Catch, and it is the first one that really explores the world of comedy as something that Daniel is drawn to. These readings are wonderful. The questions tonight were fantastic. Come to these things, people. These are really good fun. Wednesdays, 6 p.m., right here in the comfort of your own home. Listen to your breath.